The U.S. Department of Energy is cleaning up the Oak Ridge Reservation of residual hazardous and radioactive contamination left over as a result of decades of nuclear energy research. Much of that work has been influenced by the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup operations. You're welcome to attend the meetings and be part of this important work. For more information, call us or visit our website.
A lot of people have a pretty good handle on what's happening in Oak Ridge now, but in order to serve as a board member, it was suggested it might be helpful for people to understand how the EM program works nationally. So I'm going to spend just about 15 minutes tonight giving a sense of the big picture. That's the big building that pays for the big picture. That's the Forrestal building, block away from the mall, right behind the Smithsonian Institution. That's where our bosses exist, and basically that's where the EM, Environmental Management Program, is based. As you all know, the EM program nationally fundamentally was set up in the late 80s to deal with the cleanup associated with four to 5 decades worth of activity associated with first the Manhattan Project, then the Cold War, and all the associated nuclear energy development activity associated with that. So we did about 5 decades worth of learning and industrial production. In the late 80s, we jumped into the business of cleaning up after all that, and there really wasn't much focus on that prior to that. In the big picture, what we do in the cleanup program is clean up, as I mentioned, after the Cold War, the Manhattan Project, and a lot of energy, particularly nuclear energy development activities that have been sponsored by the Department of Energy for quite some time. The subcomponents of that work boil down to 3 or 4 big areas. One is tearing down a lot of old buildings that we have no use for. You'll hear that referred to as D&D, and Oak Ridge is one of the biggest D&D projects in the complex. Another big thrust is dealing with basically spent nuclear fuels and materials from weapons production. That involves dealing with a lot of what's commonly referred to as special nuclear materials, things that we don't want the wrong people to get a hold of and that need to be put into a secure status to keep us all safe. There's also a fair amount of waste that has been put into various places where it needs to be retrieved, primarily a material called transuranic waste. And that's a national program that I'll give you a little bit more information on. And then when you hear about the EM program, you often hear about something called tank waste. Sometimes it's referred to as liquid waste. But basically, whenever you're in the business of reprocessing spent nuclear fuels or producing plutonium, you have a lot of leftovers. And those leftovers end up in tanks. We have a few sites with tanks. Those tanks contain liquid waste. And that's a huge, huge component of the DOE cleanup program. All right. I mentioned, about 5 decades worth of activity, largely conducted in an unregulated environment. A lot of it conducted in a war mentality production type mindset. Of course, the Manhattan Project was a big, big push. The Cold War, again, a big, big push. DOE for decades operated outside of any environmental regulation. So you take the use of very hazardous materials, put them into secret kind of war mentality production activities, excuse any regulatory oversight, and you can end up with a pretty good environmental program. That was the basis for the EM program. After that kind of discouraging statement, I want to start with a positive note. If you look at the slide on the top, on the left, every blue dot across North America is a former cleanup obligation on the part of the Department of Energy. Some of them were the big sites like Oak Ridge and Savannah and Hanford, and others were less significant sites, no trivial challenges, but less significant sites. Some of those were private contractor facilities that supported the big sites. But as you can see, already in the couple of decades that we've been working the EM program now, we've reduced from the number of blue dots on the left-hand side to the number on the right-hand side. So we're making real progress. Naturally, the ones that are left are the big, tough ones, and the ones that we'll be working on for decades to come. What I'd like to do tonight is to give a little bit of an overview on the biggest of the big sites, and also some kind of drill down a little bit on some of the cleanup programs specific to those sites. Okay, here's the big budget picture. Terry Tyborowski from our budget office prepared this slide, and it's kind of neat because really when you look at government programs, priorities are reflective of budgets. And if you look at how this big dollar bill, which is actually about a $5.6 billion per annum budget for the EM cleanup program, you can get a sense of how we allocate our resources. The tank waste that I mentioned earlier, the leftovers from plutonium production generally, are our biggest single budget item. And we have those activities taking place at Hanford, Idaho, and the Savannah River site. Facility D&D, just taking down these massive industrial structures, many of which are no longer in use. Some of them are reactors, some of them are isotope production facilities, but all of them have no continuing use in the department's mission, and tearing them down is a big component of what we do. Oak Ridge is, of course, a big component of that. In decreasing budget order comes the spent nuclear fuel activity, then transuranic waste, soil and groundwater cleanup, which is very important, but it's not nearly as expensive or as massive of an effort as the other things. And then finally, what we call essential site services. This is just the money that we spend to make sure that we can operate in a compliant manner, running our wastewater treatment plants and our landfills and things of that sort. So Oak Ridge doesn't really play in the radioactive tank waste realm. As a point of historical fact, Oak Ridge is where they developed those separation technologies. We had some tanks that were 100,000 gallon tanks, which sounds big, but it's small compared to the million gallon tanks out at Hanford. Our tanks have already been evacuated, so we're kind of out of the tank waste business. So we don't get much of that money. We do spend a lot of money in the D&D front. The U-233 project at Ornell is an example of our place in the spent nuclear fuels realm. We do play or participate in transuranic waste activities, and of course we have a lot of soil and groundwater cleanup taking place. It's another slide slicing the pie a different way that just allows you to get a sense of how much money goes to the different states. Richland and river protection are two components of the Hanford site. So as you can see, maybe 30–40% of all of EM's budget goes out to Washington State. Savannah River is another very large site. After those two are taken away, we're about the biggest site right now. And then there are a large number of much smaller sites in terms of budget. Now, understand that Oak Ridge in the DOE complex is a big deal. We're a big part of the cleanup program. We're a huge part of the weapons mission and the science mission. This slide doesn't speak to the amount of money Oak Ridge receives for the lab and for Y-12. Okay, I'll spend just a few minutes talking about each of the big sites. This is where I'll use my cheat sheet a little bit. Okay, the Hanford site is located out in southeastern, up in the steppe desert of southeastern Washington. It was developed as the nation's, one of the two locations where the nation produces plutonium for weapons development. It actually, as I mentioned earlier, if you take the graphite reactor in the 3019 building, where we first learned how to irradiate uranium and produce plutonium, and then do chemical extractions from that fuel and extract the plutonium, process developed in Oak Ridge, exported to Hanford, Washington, and scaled up a millionfold. That's the Hanford site. So the Hanford site has a large production facility involving a fairly significant number of reactors. You've probably heard of the Hanford B reactor, which was the reactor used during the Manhattan Project itself. Further back away from the river are a lot of tank farms that contain tank waste. Luckily, it doesn't rain much out there, so there's not a big push of contamination from where it sits down into the groundwater, but there's a lot of radioactivity, a very large quantity of very high activity waste that justifies much of the budget they spend out there. That site is developing a treatment system for all their tank waste. That's their principal mission. Hanford really does not have a production mission anymore. We're not in the business of producing plutonium anymore. So aside from a small science laboratory that exists out there, it's basically a cleanup mission. Someday it will clean itself up and Hanford will not really exist as a big DOE site anymore. It's owned by the Environmental Management Program, unlike Oak Ridge, which is owned by a collection of missions. Idaho is an interesting site, located not far from Idaho Falls, about 30 miles out in the desert, excuse me, from Idaho Falls. It was a site that was developed principally to develop and test nuclear reactor technology. It's a perfect site for doing that because the location of the DOE facility itself is way out in the middle of nowhere. Most of the community that works at that site lives in Idaho Falls. A good portion of them get on a bus and go for about an hour-long car ride or bus ride to get to work. Once they get out to the Idaho, I guess it's now called INEL, Idaho National Engineering Lab, you come upon all the test facilities, and this is actually a location where they developed reactors and would run them essentially to failure. They're looking at how reactors would perform under extreme conditions. They would intentionally push reactors to the limit and see how they behaved. As you can imagine, sometimes they behave poorly or they fail and leave you with a little bit of a cleanup problem. They also did at Idaho, they also did a fair amount of spent fuel reprocessing. They developed methods for spent fuel reprocessing, which basically involves taking spent fuel and subjecting it to chemical extractions. So again, you produce a lot of liquid waste. A lot of that liquid waste is transuranic waste. So most of the cleanup activity out there is associated with decommissioning the old facilities that they've created and no longer use, and dealing with the waste streams that were produced during those active activities. There still are engineering research missions at the INEL site, so it has a continuing mission in addition to being cleaned up. Los Alamos is one of the 3 sites that were part of the Manhattan Project. It's located up on a mesa about 30, 40 miles northwest of Santa Fe. And this is where kind of the more glamorous component work of the Manhattan Project took place. Oak Ridge was the big factory that produced the fuels for the weapons. Los Alamos is where a lot of the scientists that were actually involved in the design and assembly and then testing of the nuclear bomb. They have a continuing mission. It remains a big defense laboratory, but because of the activities that took place out there during their nuclear weapons and power development activities, they also have a fairly significant cleanup mission also. A lot of the work that they did took place in canyons around the plant. Like Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, the facility is sort of integrated with the community. It's the only other site I've visited where you can be in a residential neighborhood and actually have essentially an eye shot to DOE facilities. Their cleanup budget isn't that big, their cleanup challenge isn't that big, but it is a significant, relatively significant part of the cleanup mission for Oak Ridge, for the DOE national program. The Nevada National Security Site, located north of Las Vegas, is the site where most of the weapons testing that DOE has conducted over the decades has taken place. It still has some continuing role in the defense arena. It also is a site where DOE sends a lot of its waste. It's, again, a pretty good place for the more dangerous waste streams, some of the more dangerous waste streams that DOE generates from its production missions and its cleanup mission. They only have surface disposal facilities. They have no deep geologic repositories, but they do have surface disposal facilities. So when Oak Ridge cleans up a building and it generates some material that's too hazardous for us to dispose of locally, but it's not transuranic waste, it has to be stuck 1,000 feet underground in a geologic repository, a lot of it ends up at the Nevada Test Site, formerly known as the Nevada Test Site. Now it's called NNSS. This one should be familiar to everybody. Oak Ridge is probably the most complicated DOE site in the DOE complex because of its multiple missions. The Manhattan Project to begin with, all of the money essentially spent on the Manhattan Project was managed through Oak Ridge. About half of the money associated with the Manhattan Project never left Oak Ridge because Oak Ridge played such a significant role. We had the less glamorous but heavy lift work. We were the big uranium refinery. We were the place where uranium was brought and enriched for the purpose of producing fuels for the first couple of bombs and then for a lot of work after that. So we have three principal sites now. One is the former gaseous diffusion plant, K25, which you're all familiar with, and that operated for decades and was in the business of gaseous diffusion and purifying U-235, first for weapons and then for power industry. We have our second site, the Oak Ridge National Lab, also the nation's most diverse government laboratory, and of course the Y-12 plant, which has a big defense mission. We have two sister sites in the gaseous diffusion business. In the 52-54 time frame, Washington decided that the U.S. did not have sufficient capacity to produce enriched uranium, and they decided that we needed to treble our ability to produce enriched uranium. So two more sites were built to augment the capabilities in Oak Ridge. One was the Paducah site, which I believe was built in 52. Second was the Portsmouth site, I believe opened up in 54. And their sole focus was taking uranium, which would have been converted to uranium hexafluoride, running it through this gaseous diffusion process, and enriching uranium, both, again, for power and for weapons purposes, and in some cases to run naval subs and so forth. Both of these sites are closed or closing and do not really have a big role in the DOE complex anymore other than to get themselves cleaned up, which will be a very expensive D&D job, very, very similar to what we're doing out at the K25 site. They also have become the place where all the leftovers from Oak Ridge's gaseous diffusion activities were sent. It's been years now since these big canisters of processed uranium hexafluoride existed at Oak Ridge. There were thousands of them, I believe 6,000 or 7,000. They've all been shipped up to Paducah and Portsmouth to be converted to a more stable form for disposal. So we owe some thanks to our northern friends for taking that waste, and over time they will be spending enormous amounts of money making those sites go away. Their future mission or their objectives are very similar to our objectives at the K25 site. That is to clean up the site, remove the surface facilities, and hand the sites over for redevelopment as new industrial parks for economic development activity. It's just a shot of the Paducah site. It looks an awful lot like the K25 site and the Oak Ridge site. And the last site, I believe, no, there's one more thing I'll talk about, but the last big site I'm going to mention is the Savannah River site. Savannah River site is located down outside of Aiken, South Carolina. It's a huge reservation. It's even larger than the Oak Ridge Reservation by quite a bit. And it was used to complement the Hanford site for plutonium production. It also was used for tritium production. Both of those are commodities in the weapons endeavor. It has some continuing missions because there are some unique facilities that I'll talk about in a moment at the Savannah site that make it uniquely positioned to assist in dispositioning excess plutonium. We now have more plutonium than we need or want to place into weapon systems, but the plutonium has some value as a potential use for powering power plants. So one of the things that's happening in Savannah is the development of something called a MOX plant, M-O-X, it stands for mixed oxide fuel. And it's basically a process where they can take weapons-grade plutonium, convert it into nuclear fuel, burn up, in effect, ultimately the plutonium so it's not available. So that supports our non-proliferation objectives, and it also takes care of the plutonium issue. So at Savannah River, they have problems, they have challenges. They don't have problems, just challenges. Much like exist out at Hanford. Large quantities of leftovers from plutonium production, large quantities of liquid waste. To their credit, they've actually already come up with and are operating a system for dispositioning the liquid waste and converting it into glass rods for disposal. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about some of the huge facilities we've built and programs we've established to achieve our 4 principal missions. Number 1, the Radioactive Liquid Waste Challenge. I just mentioned that at Hanford they've built this facility called the DWPF, Defense Waste Processing Facility. It's an enormous concrete structure, extremely well shielded, the largest facility of its type in the world, set up to convert a lot of this liquid waste into a solid glass. And that glass form is good for nothing other than disposal. And someday when the nation elects to site and construct sufficient underground disposal, actually geologic disposal capacity, those glass logs will be sent there. The original plan was that glass vitrified waste from this plant would be sent to the Yucca Mountain site. I think you all know the story with Yucca Mountain. It's on hold at best. So they're still stabilizing the waste, putting it into storage, and seeking a disposal alternative for that waste. Idaho is also in the business of building their analog, basically. They call it the IWTU, the Integrated Waste Treatment Unit. It should start operating fairly shortly, and it too will process Idaho's liquid tank waste facilities. These are all multi-billion-dollar facilities to give you a sense of how big they are. Fortunately, we Oak Ridge are not reliant on those facilities because we don't have the type of waste that requires that type of facility for processing. But those are big, big construction projects. The one on top is done and operating. I believe the one below is supposed to get going before too long. And then at Hanford, they are also building an even larger, the largest processing facility for tank waste. That project, which I don't even know what the estimated price tag is for it now, it's billions and billions of dollars. I can get the number for you, but it's a lot more than we ever expected it to be. It's taking a lot longer to build it than we ever expected to build it. It is the biggest push in the Department of Energy right now, and hopefully we will get it done because the cost of maintaining the waste in the tanks is so high. This is one of those projects that if we can get it done, we can relieve the department of a huge carrying cost and have money available then to complete the balance of the cleanup missions in Oak Ridge. But that's what you can see so far. Over on the left-hand side is the part that's still under construction. It seems to be undergoing a lot of design reviews and so forth. But Hanford is the biggest project in the Department of Energy, and it's still got a ways to go. Okay. The other big thing we do that I mentioned is facility decommissioning, tearing down old buildings and throwing them away. And Oak Ridge has the biggest of the active decommissioning projects in the entire complex. And you're all familiar with the K-25 building. Up on the top of the slide is the way it looked not too many years ago. Lower end of the slide is actually not quite what it looks like now because this component of the building, it's the big U, remember, about a mile around, about 45 acres. We did this wing first, the west wing went next. After a lot of evaluation on the possibility of preserving what's called the north tower of the north wing, we concluded we could not, and we've now dismantled it and disposed of it. All that's left is a little bit of one wing of the building that has some unique contamination challenges. We're actually just about to get approval for the disposition plan for that, and we'll be tearing it down also. So before long, the K-25 building will be gone, but it was really the biggest D&D project in the world, and it's going to be done pretty soon. And it's fairly typical of the D&D, decontamination and decommissioning projects that DOE takes on. Not real high tech. You basically have to deal with the safety issues to make the building safe to take down. And then you dismantle it with large, what they call heavy iron, huge pieces of construction equipment that dismantle the building, load it into trucks, and all the material from D&D projects, for the most part, goes to disposal. This is surface disposal. About 90% of the volume of waste from D&D projects is typically disposed of at the site that originates it. So in the case of Oak Ridge, the D&D waste is taken to the Environmental Management Waste Management Facility. About 10% of it is challenges our waste disposal capabilities in Oak Ridge, so it gets sent out west. A lot of it to the Nevada test site. Okay, and this is just another slide that brings back the next big D&D projects to go are our sister plants up in Paducah and Portsmouth. This is a lot of these buildings look the same. I apologize for that, but this is something that you'll hear referred to sometimes as the H Canyon at the Savannah River site. It's the unique facility I mentioned before. It's a huge concrete tank. And within that concrete tank, that's extremely well shielded, very, very thick concrete walls. You can throw spent nuclear fuels, all types of highly hazardous, very radioactive material, and subject them to chemical extractions or chemical processing methods. So it's the only facility we have of that type in the complex, and it plays a big role in dealing with some of our spent nuclear fuels. So I just threw a slide up there because you'll hear about the H Canyon. A lot of times when people have a challenging waste and they don't know what to do with it, the answer seems to be take it down to the H Canyon, dissolve it in acid, and dispose of the material. Okay. Nuclear materials. There was a lot of plutonium at a few different locations, and Oak Ridge actually has a pretty big chunk of the Special Nuclear Materials Enterprise in DOE. It's the U-233, or Building 3019 building you just got a presentation on not too long ago. This is very challenging work. It's very expensive. The dollars per mass of material managed are very, very high, but it's very important work because in each case, Oak Ridge has its case and other sites have theirs, you're often dealing with material that actually could be used to make weapons. And it's excess to our weapons needs. So basically we are in the business of making it go away. In this case, our special nuclear material that nobody wants is co-located with the Oak Ridge National Lab, which the world wants. The world wants to send its scientists to Oak Ridge to do its research. So it's a huge priority for us, and the same story exists at a few other sites in the complex, to make those special nuclear materials go away. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about the transuranic waste challenge. Transuranic waste is waste that has a very, very long half-life and tends to be fairly mobile in the environment, so it requires special disposal methods. Transuranic waste is not, actually by law, is required to be managed in a geologic repository. So we've built a facility out in southern New Mexico called the WIP, Waste Isolation Pilot Project, at New Mexico, where they basically have tunneled down, I believe, in excess of 1,000 feet into salt formations, carved cavities into the salt formations, and use that to isolate this material that lasts a long time and is particularly hazardous. The concept, and it works, is that you place the material in this extremely stable and dry setting. Over time, the salt, which is actually behaves as a liquid, it just moves very slowly, re-encases the waste, and it's permanently locked up in that disposal facility. So that facility is very important to the DOE cleanup program because it's the only geologic repository we have right now. And a lot of sites send their waste to it. In fact, I believe the next site shows that we, Savannah, and Idaho are all dependent upon that facility for our success. There's talk of having some additional waste sent to that facility. So we all kind of owe some thanks to Carlsbad. I can remember 15 years ago when I'd put a drawing up showing how waste went from one facility to the other. There tended to be arrows going west and some arrows going east. In other words, there was more equity on the marketing and exchange of waste. Right now, I think the east is winning and the west is kind of losing. We, Oak Ridge, used to have an arrow that came to us because we had this big incinerator. that was the only incinerator of its type that could take certain types of radiologically and PCB contaminated oils from Paducah and Portsmouth and elsewhere across the complex. So we were kind of doing our share to support the Oak Ridge cleanup, the National Cleanup Program. I still think we are, but we aren't taking much waste from anywhere else. There are some commercial facilities in town, but those are just commercial facilities like commercial facilities in any other state. So it's just, I think, something to keep in the back of our mind, that where we can safely dispose of our waste locally, it's probably in our interstate equity, good neighbor interest to do so. We will always be dependent on the western states for disposal of some of our waste streams. Okay, and the TRU is just an example of that. And just a couple more slides. Because the cleanup program, the National Cleanup Program, is focusing on facilities that were built for a very specific purpose. They're usually one-of-a-kind facilities that don't exist anywhere else. Facilities that were built not with their ultimate shutting down and cleanup in mind, and facilities that were built with some pretty uniquely hazardous materials. We have some pretty large technological challenges associated with cleaning them up, particularly the super high hazard facilities out west. So it is our hope that by investing some amount of money in technology development, we might find some clever techniques for reducing the cost, the projected enormous cost of completing the cleanup mission across the nation. Now in Oak Ridge, we have some high-tech challenging things, but a lot of our work is more low-tech, tearing down buildings, packaging waste, closing old landfills. So our technology development needs may not be as profound as some other sites, though we do have some. Anything we can do to better characterize and identify where mercury is going to be helpful for us in cleaning up Oak Ridge, as an example. We do have very complicated groundwater challenges in Oak Ridge, so technology development in the area of groundwater contamination characterization or modeling is in our interest. We aren't in the business of loading glass, and we really don't do much separation, so those two components aren't important to us. But I just wanted to mention that there is a national technology development program that's part of EM. Some of the work is done at the national labs, but about, up there it says our request is 2014, I believe we target about 2% of our site budgets for technology development. Okay, and then the last slide before questions. In the big picture, this massive cleanup program faces huge financial challenges. The national government is wrestling with a very difficult fiscal situation, and EM is challenged by that just like any other program. So getting the job done will require a lot of creativity and the identification of intelligent, cost-effective cleanup approaches.
I thought we might start with a map of the reservation as an introduction. The red areas, of course, are the contaminated areas, and the blue area up there in the corner is the watershed that surrounds ETTP, and then you see the Bear Creek Valley watershed in bright yellow, the East Fork Poplar Creek watershed, the Bethel Valley watershed in light yellow, and then below that the Melton Valley watershed. Now, the contamination is mostly surrounding the major facilities in each of those watersheds. And as you may notice, that green boundary is the city limits of Oak Ridge, and most of the reservation is within the city limits of Oak Ridge. Also, you probably can see that most of the reservation is not contaminated. Of about 34,000 acres, less than 10% is contaminated. And most of the contamination is on site. There is the carbon chloride plume that comes out of Y12 and goes into Union Valley. There's, of course, the mercury in the floodplain and the sediments of East Fork Poplar Creek. And there's radioactive cesium and strontium and tritium in the Clinch River. Stewardship is in place. It's not, the reservation is not completely without stewardship. I don't want to give you that idea. There are deed restrictions, and if there are any changes in surface or groundwater use in Union Valley, the owners of that property have to notify DOE of any changes. There's signage along East Fork Poplar Creek. That is, if the signage has not been torn down by vandals or whatever. And of course, there is the White Oak Creek Dam, which limits the amount of contaminant release to the Clinch River. We also know that DOE continues to release low level of contaminants, but these are under permits, and they're granted by the state. However, really, when you think about it, Oak Ridge is really probably one of the safest communities in the United States. We're well monitored. The contaminated areas are well maintained, and there is state-of-the-art surveillance and emergency response available. So I've lived here for 34 years now, and I'm quite comfortable living here. I hope all the rest of you are too who live in town. Turning now to a timeline of stewardship activities. The SSAB was established in 1995. I think it was sort of towards the end of 1995, as I remember. And in 1996, the state and EPA told DOE that it had to include, there had to be more public involvement in EM cleanup, and also in end-use decisions for the contaminated areas on the reservation. And so DOE came to the SSAB, which was a new organization at that time, mind you, and we were struggling with bylaws and budgets and what kinds of committees we were going to have. And we were just getting organized, so to speak. But DOE came to us and asked us if we would consider having a public meeting of citizens and to talk to them about end uses on the reservation and ask for public involvement in the environmental management program. And so we advertised a public meeting, and there were about 100 people there. I think it was in the cafeteria at Robertsville, but anyway, of those 100 people, about 30 of them decided they were going to be part of this effort of this public involvement in DOE activities. And so we convened the End Use Working Group. And as we struggled with the issues related to the end uses of the contaminated areas on the reservation, we realized as a group that the contamination wasn't going to go away, that cleanup was not really cleanup. And so we couldn't agree to leaving the contamination on the reservation unless plans for a long-term stewardship program in place. And so the End Use Working Group convened the Stewardship Committee. And both of those groups met bi-weekly, mind you. And there was some duplication of people on those groups, but a lot of the people who were interested in end uses were not necessarily interested in long-term stewardship, but regardless, There were committee meetings, there were steering group meetings, and really for a while there, for about a year and a half, we all felt that we had full-time jobs. However, we were not paid, of course, but we did work very hard. The End-Use Working Group published their report in July of 1998. And the Stewardship Committee, the first volume, was also published at that time. And then the End-Use Working Group and the Stewardship Committee were disbanded. But we knew at that time that more work was needed. And so a Stewardship Working Group was formed in 1999. And we looked at long-term stewardship in CERCLA documents, and we were looking at how to involve the community in these efforts, and we were worried about information retention and availability, and also about funding. Well, we wrestled with those issues and published another volume on long-term stewardship in December of '99. Also that year, we convened a national long-term stewardship workshop here in Oak Ridge, and there were about 100 people who came from all over the United States. About half of that group were from the other 9 SSABs. And then there were headquarters people and TDEC people and local DOE people, EPA people, and interested local groups, and it was a lively situation. We did come up, believe it or not, with some recommendations that were sent as a body and from the assembled SSABs to headquarters. And then finally, when the Stewardship Working Group was disbanded in 2000, the SSAB formed a standing stewardship committee, and that's the committee that right now, of course, is being merged with the Environmental Management Committee. But something else important happened in 2001. We convinced DOE that they had to establish the Stewardship Committee as a de facto citizens board for stewardship, so that when EM was finished, or when the SSAB was disbanded, that there would be a citizens group who would continue to have oversight of long-term stewardship on the reservation. And it would be formalized once the SSAB was disbanded. It's very important that that commitment, which you will find in the public involvement plan, that it remains in the public involvement plan, because the PIP is an FFA document, and therefore it's legally defensible. So if there are questions down the road, we have a way to hold DOE's feet to the fire with regard to long-term stewardship. Well, this is a pretty impressive bunch of things that have happened for those first years, but it really could not have happened if we didn't have dedicated members of the community working often night and day. And then we had the cooperation and the support of the local DOE people, and I can't say enough about that. The environmental management program just provided us with everything that we thought we needed in order to make end-use decisions, in order to develop a long-term stewardship program. And there was the participation of the TDEC as well. So a lot of people were involved, and it was exciting. It was very exciting. Things have quieted down a lot since then, but that doesn't mean that the responsibilities for oversight and the fact that we need long-term stewardship is important. At that time, it seemed to be more important because the finishing times for the environmental management program activities on the reservation were a lot closer to now than they are now when they're way out there in the future someplace. But anyway, moving on. This is our definition of stewardship. Now, because the word stewardship means so many different things to so many different people, that we had to come up with a definition that applied to remediation on the reservation. And we had to reach consensus on this definition. And that took a while. But, well, for instance, imagine if this group were the ones who were trying to come up with a definition of stewardship in relation to environmental management, to remediation. Imagine just what that would mean when each of you has a different view of what it means. So we did reach consensus, and it seems to have stood the test of time because it continues to guide our stewardship efforts. The next thing on the agenda was we had to work out some goals for long-term stewardship. And first we had to identify what we figured were the essential elements of effective stewardship, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide. And then we wanted to develop long-term stewardship requirements, and we wanted to identify options and promote the acquisition of adequate long-term funding for stewardship. Now the second two goals we decided had to be legally described, must be described in legally defensible documents, and that meant that we had to see it in the CERCLA records of decision. Funding is still a problem. It's not satisfactory for long-term stewardship. Annual appropriations really just don't do it. It has to be more stable funding and funding that's not subject to the whims of Congress. Things that have been mentioned have been trust funds, entitlements. There are a couple of other things that have come up. Nothing has really ever been decided on how to fund long-term stewardship. However, here in Oak Ridge, we do have a unique arrangement between DOE and the state, whereby the state and DOE signed a consent order for a pooled investment fund of $14 million to take care of maintenance and monitoring and whatever the environmental management waste cell in Bear Creek Valley requires once it's completed. DOE puts $1 million a year into this fund, and it's my understanding that if a new waste cell is built, that a similar arrangement will be made for long-term stewardship of the next waste cell. We also wanted to promote public understanding of stewardship. We felt it was very important that the community and people in the region understood just what the issues were, the fact that the contamination isn't going away, that there's going to have to be people to take care of it, money to take care of it, oversight. And then we wanted to promote interaction between the individuals and the governments. Well, the state and DOE are bound by law to include public involvement. And as long as the public has a good understanding of the issues, there's recourse for long-term stewardship. The local government seems to have its head in the sand with regard to contamination on the reservation and stewardship for the contamination over the long term. They have told us, when we questioned them about it, that if they're to have a role in long-term stewardship or cleanup on the reservation, the DOE is going to have to provide the funding for whatever that role is. So the city really hasn't played a part. Early on, we gave presentations all over. We gave presentations to local groups. We gave presentation to a working group of the City Council. We gave presentations across the country to other SSABs, and I even was invited to talk about stewardship at a multi-agency meeting for environmental management at the Academy of Sciences in DC. It was interesting because, you know, we have the hazardous waste and the radioactive elements, but think about the Air Force, okay? They have pools of jet fuel under their facilities, and they've got to worry about that. Or think about the Army, which has unexploded ordnance in many places across the country, particularly in Chesapeake Bay, I understand. So anyway, other agencies have similar problems, and this workshop was an effort for agencies to get together and talk about, you know, what needs to be done about managing contamination and long-term stewardship. Okay, we had finally to, not finally, but we had to consider what we thought were the elements of stewardship. If you remember, CERCLA was codified in 1980, and at that time, EPA assumed that cleanup of these contaminated sites around the United States was going to be cleanup, and that was that. However, it wasn't long before or after CERCLA was implemented that the feds and other government agencies realized that cleanup was not really cleanup, and that much of the contamination was going to remain on site. The problem was, because EPA was so thought that the cleanup was going to be permanent, there was no there were no arrangements or nothing in CERCLA that talked about long-term stewardship. And of course, that was one of our main concerns, and that's why we insisted, and we continue to insist, that DOE has to consider long-term stewardship at the same time that they're considering the various options for remediation, which means early in the CERCLA process, which is with the RIFS. And that has to be carried through, of course, the proposed plans, and then into the RODS, which means that whatever is said there is legally defensible. Well, the goal is long-term protection of human health and the environment. And so to get there, we decided the authority and the funding was sort of at the top of this pyramid. And of course, the federal government is fiscally, under CERCLA, is fiscally and legally responsible for remediation, and also for long-term stewardship, as long as it's included in the CERCLA RODS. Funding, well, that's a problem. I've already mentioned that. That's not been solved. But under CERCLA, the federal government is also responsible for funding of the cleanup. The next box is the stewards. The principal steward, of course, is the federal entity. And in our case, of course, it's the Department of Energy. The implementation stewards are those that are responsible for the operations of stewardship. And that generally means the contractors that DOE employs to carry out these operations of stewardship. Oversight is under EPA and TDEC, and should be the county and the city, but that's not quite where it should be. The Site-Specific Advisory Board and any other organizations that care to take a role in oversight of what goes on the reservation. The operations are pretty clear-cut. There's the monitoring, there's the maintenance of any kind of remediation, there's the surveillance, which means that regulatory oversight of remediation. And there's reevaluation, because you have to look at the effectiveness of the systems and also the continuing need for whatever has been put in place. Public participation, again, a very important part of long-term stewardship and of cleanup on the reservation. There need to be meetings and information and documents, and the public is included in the EPA requirement for 5-year review. DOE has invited stakeholders to be part of that field exercise, and it's important that you all understand that you can play a role in that 5-year review. And of course, there's the enforcement element of all of these various operations. Institutional controls, they are controls that limit development or restrict access. There are permits, ordinances, legally binding provisions. The physical controls are, of course, those that don't allow access, such as there are barriers and buffer zones and signs and guards and all of the things that protect the contaminated areas on the reservation. The information systems are very important. You've got to know what the waste is, and in the past, that's been part of the problem, because early on, good records were not kept or they were destroyed inadvertently. And so sometimes in going out to clean up an area, nobody had any clue as to what it was that they were dealing with. So waste information is very important, and property information is important. You know, where is the waste? These information systems need to be complete. They need to be available, and over time, you know, things change. So information is a big part of understanding what's on the reservation and what kind of long-term stewardship is needed. Of course, research is important too, because there are new technologies that come along. There are site changes and waste changes, and so there has to be an allowance for research with regard to stewardship. Well, that gives you sort of a quick outline of what we were looking at early on. So that's everything that I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel.
The U.S. Department of Energy's Oak Ridge Reservation is the site of a vital national defense facility and a modern computational and scientific center. But over the years, parts of the reservation have been contaminated with radioactive and other hazardous waste. DOE has been busy cleaning up those affected areas, but much remains to be done. Citizen input is a valuable part of that effort, and DOE welcomes advice from the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup of the Oak Ridge Reservation. The board provides input on a wide range of environmental cleanup operations underway at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Y-12 National Security Complex, and the East Tennessee Technology Park. You can be part of this important work by attending the monthly meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board. For more information, call or visit our website.